Enough for me. I'll call this meeting officially to order at 5:35 on 10/6/2020 here. This is Sean. Thank you all for joining us. Maria, Melissa, Amy, I don't think we have any public audience. Correct? I didn't get any comments. All right. The minutes from the last meeting are in our packet. Any questions, concerns, updates, changes?
Look good to me.
All right. Mr. Bush, thank you for chairing the meeting in my absence last time.
Oh, wait till you get my bill.
I appreciate that. It's right up there. It's right up there with mine. All right. Although you probably are a higher rate. All right. So there was some options, some scenarios that you guys all went away with that we are going to discuss this evening and try to continue to form consensus around the direction. I believe, Linda, I did get your voicemail late in the day. I'm sorry I did not get a chance to call you back. There was a draft circulated on potential options for basically a compromise within that space. I think both the scenarios, Linda, and your draft, correct me if I'm wrong, are in the spirit of there's many different ways to solve this. And I think if we're all open-minded and we're all a little bit creative and we all give a little bit, I think it'll work out for the taxpayers. It'll work out for the fund. It'll work out for the golf course, the pool, and ultimately for something that the Board of Finance can get behind it and pass as well, right? So there's a lot of constituencies here that we need to make sure are represented. Linda, sorry, Dave, is there anything else from last meeting that I missed in that very brief summary in terms of pulling forward to today?
Not at all. I think you were spot on that. I think that was our goal from the last meeting, was to just kind of define a little better, the parameters of what we need to be talking about.
Okay. So I see that we have scenario 1 and scenario 2 up on the screen. Maria, Melissa, Amy, do we want to go through those first?
Yeah, we could help with that, or would you prefer for us to pull up the homework assignment first? It's really whatever your preference is.
The homework, the one I didn't do, right? Because I saw today that there was homework. Yeah, so much like my high school career. Yes, please.
Okay. So we did our best based on the responses we had received from folks to try to tackle, the two larger questions, which was the accounting approach and what, if any, community use expenditures would folks like to perhaps see the general fund help contribute towards. So we didn't quite get responses from everyone. And then we did have a few question marks in terms of we just wanted to clarify with people and understand what they had intended. So starting with the accounting approach, Linda, we weren't sure from your email, were you suggesting perhaps status quo, that we keep the special revenue fund as is at the moment in terms of not moving expenditures or revenues out of it, but keeping everything in the revenue fund?
No, I was also suggesting that we move, let's see, a total of $265,000 around to the Board of Selectmen. 180 of it, I mean, we all talked about last time that 180,000, we fund that up front. If we just move those expenses into the Board of Selectmen budget, there's no impact. So that's a layup. The other part that I suggested looking at, do you really want me to go into this now, or do you want to do your things first?
Sure, maybe we'll come back to that question for you, maybe work through the rest of the homework assignment for other folks. And then Jerry and Dave, we understood it that you guys selected option C, which is moving all expenditures and revenues to the general fund with the exception of the golf course, and that the golf course would remain its own special revenue fund.
That is correct.
Great. Okay. And then Chris, we wanted to make sure that we understood your email correctly. Were you suggesting that the fund remain as it is for the recreation component, just with a larger general fund contribution, and then have a second revenue fund for golf? We just weren't sure if you were.
No. So my high level is exploring the establishment of a golf dependent accounting fund, and then the general, and then the cost of Parks and Rec being borne out of the general fund.
Got it. So option C.
And then looking at some amount and not allocating costs, operational costs from staff operational costs to the golf course if they're not applicable at all to the golf course.
Got it. That's really helpful. Thank you. Let's see. And then Sean and Art, do either of you have a preference for any of those items, or would you be under other, please specify?
I'm under I want to hear how this debate goes and still learn.
Okay.
I came into this of mind of option C, but I'm willing to hear Linda's, which I think is a bit of a hybrid between some of these options as well, if I would summarize it. Right, Linda?
Yep.
Okay. So, leaning towards option C as well, but again, very open-minded to what Linda proposed.
Okay, thanks. That's really helpful. And then just recapping the homework assignment for potential funding of community use expenditures. A was proposing that 70% of the salaries and benefits for the director and the secretary be paid for by the general fund. And again, from emails, and please correct us if we're wrong, it looked like Linda, Chris, Jerry, and Dave had some consensus around that particular item.
Yeah, you could move me from D up to C on that.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, wonderful. And then Sean or Art, any feelings about whether or not you agree with A potentially or not?
No, I'm still taking it all in.
Okay.
I mean, by virtue of that, I agreed to C above. I have to agree to A, B, and C below, right? That's essentially what they are. So yes.
In
Okay.
essence, yes.
Okay.
But again, I mean, conceptually, that's what we're looking at for the big bogeys. But if we talk about suggested options for the board, fine. I mean, these are our recommendation, and this is the cleanest and probably simplest way. But to Linda's point via email, this is also got to pass the Board of Finance. So I do want to be open to that. This is the high level recommendation, but that it might get tweaked, or we might need to explore additional options for the ultimate dollars and cents and budgetary impact.
Definitely.
Maria,
Let's see.
the accounting approach up here, I would move my initials to E, the other.
Okay.
Yep.
Got it. Thank you.
But in terms of the research that you guys all did, right, Maria, on the 70% number and the rec supervisor and the utility cost, I mean, I think those are the right three buckets in terms of the numbers that we're talking about here. And then it's just back to the accounting. Is it as simple as C, or is it C plus a little bit of tweaking, right?
Yeah, I think so. And what's helpful with the homework assignment, just looking at the funding of the community use expenditures, it seemed like in general, folks were more comfortable picking from those buckets of A through C, as opposed to just saying on an annual basis, the general fund will support the overall, fund 20%, 25%, 30%. I think it's helpful because that was one of the policy considerations we really wanted you all to consider. But since there wasn't anybody who felt strongly about it, I think that's helpful again from us from a budgeting perspective as we're preparing the budget. We know that's not a consideration. So that's helpful in that regard, that we can kind of take D off the table.
Yep.
Yeah, my biggest concern is when we start talking percentages. Every year when you're doing your budget, those percentages could change. And I understand that because you got to try and find dollars to meet revenue. But my biggest concern is this was a situation with all good intentions back in 1999 when this was created to solve a problem, and it actually created a bigger problem. So I think we're going back to trying to right the wrong that was done.
So I agree. If we move to the simple math, Maria, if it's okay.
Got it.
Could we just put up on, just to keep this Excel document, just
Yeah, definitely. The funding scenarios tab.
just even, yeah, I mean, this works. But again, there's a lot of numbers here. So essentially you add in scenario one, you added up A and C. Where was B though?
B shows up in the other one.
Oh, yeah. So go down to scenario two if you don't mind. So that's the totality, right? So
Yes.
if we have consensus around the three items or close to consensus around the three items, the total is 457 is essentially the number. So for simplicity, we'll call it $500,000. That is presumably moving from the special revenue fund to the general fund, right?
Yes, and then the general fund is taking out the 180 that's up front now.
Right. Yep. So the net is the 277,500, right? So, and then Linda had proposed some creative and thoughtful options for how do we close the gap around those numbers, right, Linda? That's what you were kind of chipping away at.
Yeah, but let me start off by saying I didn't agree to the whole 457,000 because I came at this from a different perspective. I mean, you're picking things to move as opposed to my approach was what's the typical shortfall been? Mm-hmm. And the shortfall on average over the last 5 years has been 266,000. So I'm happy to move 266,000. But I don't want to move more than is necessary to cover the gap.
Yeah, and I appreciate where you're coming from. I guess the consensus that has been built though is that if we move the actual numbers versus the historical gap, then we're tracking with all the other normalized increases and or decreases that we have. So energy costs go up by 5%. The utility and facilities cost line item here would go up by 5%. So from a management standpoint, I'm assuming, and Amy, correct me if I'm wrong, the general wage increases, the facility cost increases, et cetera, would track with the rest of the Board of Selectmen budget. Amy, that makes sense.
Say that again.
So like,
yeah, I didn't follow it either.
Basically, general wages for our employees go up 2.25% when you run the average, right? Or 2.3 or whatever it is when you factor in. So the rec salary, the administrative secretary, the director salary would all fall into that. And instead of trying to figure out the calculation for the shortfall, because we're moving over the actual salary number, it moves with the rest of the budget in terms of percentage changes.
Yeah. You're working with knowns versus the unknown.
Correct.
Right.
So we're essentially eliminating the possibility of the gap by officially moving these over versus picking the target. There can still be, but it's solely at that point based on weather and revenue, if I have it correctly, versus expenditure allocation. Right, Amy? Because essentially if we don't balance to zero, it's because we didn't hit the rounds of golf we projected, or the hockey rink participation, or the outings, et cetera, right? It's not because we only moved 260 over as a theoretical average versus the known cost, I guess is where I'm
spot on, Sean.
Yeah, that's an accurate statement.
So Linda, I understand and appreciate where you're coming from, but I think my recommendation, at least from to give to the Board of Finance, is I think we have more of a concrete number to give them here to say, hey, look, this is what it's going to be versus this is what we think it might be. Eleanor.
Well, yeah, the flip side of that is, by basing it on the last 5 years, it also creates some incentive to manage revenue and expenses.
I agree. My challenge with that space is I think we have, and I think we did a good job with that, or Tom and Jerry before have done a good job with that. I think we still need to, and I think the accountability is if there continues to be a gap, we have to come to you for a transfer, and if we haven't done our job on managing the expenditure side, we have that debate during the budget of whether in the tri-board meeting in terms of do we get 2, do we get 2 1/4, do we get 1 1/2? I still think there's an opportunity for your board to manage hours in the process from that space, but it's just my perspective.
Okay, well, go ahead with your proposal and
Okay.
we can come back to this.
Well, I honestly, I think the 277 is where we then bring in yours, because this scenario too, Maria and Amy, correct me if I'm wrong, basically assumes that we put that into the Board of Selectmen expenditure budget, or we put it in as a shortfall on the revenue side, and it essentially balances itself out by collection or otherwise, right? Those are the two ways we could potentially fund it. So assuming we move it into the general fund and budget for it, which I think is probably the appropriate thing to do, that would hit the Board of Selectmen budget with a $277,500 increase. Right?
Right.
Which you're going to have a hard time swallowing.
Right. And then that's where I'm particularly interested in your suggestion of some of the tweaks with how do we phase that in or account for that so that it's not it's $200,000 is a 1% increase in the Board of Selectmen budget, give or take, right, Amy?
Know that offhand, I'm not that good.
I mean, we're roughly what, 21 million? So,
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
So it's like
20 million.
2.25%, 2 1/3, whatever, or 1 1/3%. So, all right.
A quick question, if I may, because I hear the numbers being tossed around. That Linda, you have a number of 266, and I'm looking on the screen at number 277. Are we really debating an $11,000 difference?
No, that's not. Those things are not parallel. The 266. If you're looking at the 277 on this scenario 2, the 266,000 is parallel to the 457. No, it isn't. But so what isn't accounted for in your number of the 277 is two things that I thought we should address, because going forward you're going to have an impact from the minimum wage increase, and you're going to have an impact from the pension changes. And I don't want to, come up with a solution and then you're right back behind the 8 ball again with shortfalls because we didn't anticipate those two increases in expenses that are going to hit the budget of the special revenue fund. So I built those in. Now those are rough numbers because, I mean, if we take some stuff out of the special revenue fund and move it like $180,000, that would presumably reduce those a little bit, but not enormously. And the pension changes, I only had a number from Amy of 40,000, but that doesn't include all of the pension changes that are going to happen. So that number will actually be bigger, but I don't know how big it will be.
Yeah, and that's a fair point, Linda. So I guess I was assuming that, and Amy, keep me honest here, that some or most or all of those pension changes were going to hit in the scenario too. I mean, obviously we're only taking the 70%, but that 70% of the pension changes for those two folks was accounted for. And then if there's pension for the rec supervisor, obviously 100% there. So is there a lot left over for the rest of the fund?
No, so you're right. So it'll hit as a percentage. So that 166 will turn into a graded number depending on what that pension cost is.
Yeah. So if anything, we should tweak that. We should tweak these numbers from a salary standpoint to account for the pension change, assuming the pension change is going to happen, right?
Yes, that would be a little difficult. The actuaries come up with those numbers. So I only have like the fiscal year 21.
Yep.
Work off of, but that 40,000 that Linda mentioned would get us to, I believe, implementing the new mortality tables. So if the Board of Finance decided to do just the mortality tables, we'd be okay. But if they decided to do the mortality tables and the interest rate assumption, we'd have to increase beyond that 40,000. And then, of course, we don't know what's going to happen with the interest rates throughout the year for next budgeting cycle for them to come up with their new budgeted numbers for us when the actuaries do our estimates.
Now, that's based upon all 3 employees being in a defined benefit plan?
Yes. Wait, hold on. Yes, that's accurate. Yep.
And do we know that all 3 are in the defined benefit plan?
Yes.
Okay.
Let me go back to Dave's question, though. Dave, the parallel numbers then would be in scenario 2, the 457,000 versus in my proposal, the 381,000. A little bit bigger of a difference. But I mean, it's.
And Linda, that's, thank God you're on Board of Finance and I'm not. I look at that and say, if we are arguing over 70 grand on fixing a problem and fixing it right, I just seem like you gotta be, and it's not you personally, it's, I can't believe we're having that debate, but I understand that I'm not on the Board of Finance and I just look at this as, let's fix this thing. We've been doing it, it's a third try. Scenario 2 is spot on. Let's take care of the problem. The hit. I just, and again, somebody tell me, what's the hit to the taxpayer? What's a dollar value? Are we talking $1.95 or are we?
Yeah, so I think you guys are both right, though. I think scenario 2 is the pathway, but I think we've got to account for all the costs. And Linda, if I could summarize, I think what you're saying is we haven't accounted for potentially minimum wage and pension.
Right.
So I can speak to minimum wage, Sean and Linda. We have every year when we set the prices, we did that big table for you about the impact of minimum wage, but we did build it into camp fees this past summer. We built it into the ring fees this winter. For public skate and skating lessons, we raised those rates to accommodate. And I said this during the presentation to get the rates approved, that this is why we are raising rates. And we'll have to do that going forward. What I did say is that if we continue down this path as minimum wage approaches $15, if it stays on that path, and we can have to continue to have the overhead charges that we do, we're going to make swimming and skating at Simsbury Farms in a public fashion unaffordable. That's why it's important that, philosophically, we realize that these things are amenities that the town wants to fund, and we reduce the overhead cost so that we are, accounting for salaries, for minimum wage increases, and the direct materials involved with those programs, rather than my salary or turning the lights on at the farms or the water costs at the pool. If we're going to keep them affordable for families, we got to have to take these things into consideration.
Yep, and I agree, and that's a slightly different conversation than what we're trying to close the fund delta right now, right? And that's step 2 of then keeping the fund solvent, right? And I know they go together, but I do want to get step 1 done first. So, but to that point though, so Amy, just take me back to the pension. The pension charges are $40,000 for the people on this list, or $40,000 for the rec fund in its entirety?
The rec fund in its entirety.
Okay.
It's an increase of $40,000.
Okay. So for simplicity purposes, because the rec fund doesn't have rates right now that support those pension changes, we would need to add 40 to we would need to add a row underneath 15 and make it D, and it would be 40,000 for pension changes. And then we need to add a row E for what what are we looking at here for the 2021, 2022, and this is where we can debate it, minimum wage costs outside of what's we're covered through camp and other fees.
Yeah, Amy, one question. That 40,000, most of the employees in the revenue fund are golf employees. Is that 40,000 including those people? The 4 full-timers over there? Because it's four full-timers over there plus the 3 at the main building.
No, the allocation for it would be only for those charged to the portion of the general fund. So it would be you and Krista. Okay.
And John, potentially.
Yes.
Okay. So Amy, I have that right, that we do need to add 40 to the number as we're debating the total here?
Yeah, because when Tom gets his budget in terms of the pension for our 4 golf employees, then we retroactively take a look at our budget and adjust our fees accordingly.
Correct. So just to summarize, the 40 is respect to the non-golf portion of what we provide down at the farms from a potential pension increase that we know is coming. Right, Amy?
Sorry for the chimes, but yes, that's right.
Okay, sorry. I'm sorry I'm being so literal here. I just want to make sure that we get the numbers. So Melissa, do you have control of the screen?
I do. You want me to add that into underneath here?
Would you
Okay.
please just, not that I wanted to get to the 500,000, but we just did. So
Nice job.
you like that? I like round numbers. And then
Put 2,500 in for me and then you get to 500.
easy now. So and this one's harder, but do we have any ballpark for of Linda's 75,000 in fiscal year 2022 for the minimum wage impact in terms of, is that just, again, the same revenue fund X golf? Is that the entire fund? Do we have any way to break that one out?
Tom, don't you just collect that or work that into your fees?
We have been. I don't know where the 75,000 is coming from. Is that cumulative? Is that cumulative over the last 2 years?
No, so that's what, there's like a 3-year implementation of the minimum wage and the total was like 225,000. So
I recall that 75,000 being the townwide impact that year, not necessarily the impact on the rec department that year. Because this year it was roughly 25,000. It was in the 20s. Next year, I think it's going to be in the 30s. I don't imagine it got to 75 in 1 year that quickly.
did it mention it in the memo? Or am I making that up?
I don't remember.
Somebody gave me the 225,000 number. I don't know where it came from.
Okay. So let's get that. I mean, let's get that baked out. We don't have to
Yeah.
get 100% buttoned up, but let's put in, just for my sake tonight, Melissa, if you don't mind, put in 25. Or put in 30. Tom, you said 30 last year?
I think that's what it was, Sean. Yeah.
That's fine with me. Again, these don't have to be precise tonight. We're not going to fully vote on it, but we'll get these cleaned up. But again, I think it's important to frame the scope of the entirety of this. And again, this is doing this analysis, again, Linda and Art, correct me if I'm wrong, helps with the Board of Finance explanation and the ultimate understanding of how we're going to fund this stuff, I assume. So
that 25 is your lifeguards, your camp counselors, because
skating
all the
instructors.
programs are, pardon?
Yes, and the skating rink, the winter.
Okay.
So we can have a really fun debate at some point on how much the users should bear the cost of that, how much the taxpayer should. And Tom, I think that's what you were getting at before, right? Is at some point the cost to swim at Simsbury Farms becomes too high if we continue to just allocate the minimum wage increases against the user fee. Is that what you're articulating?
The minimum wage increases without changing any of the overhead charges. Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
So once again, this is why your votes in November matter. So not for people locally, but all right. So we've got this cost to bear. These are collectively, I believe, the knowns.
Yes.
Is there anything else, Linda, that from your analysis that we're missing?
Of costs that need to be covered? No.
Okay. So then, I mean, back to your 266. Your 266,051 is your average of revenue minus expenses over the 5 years. And then, Melissa, is it possible to zoom out? There we go. Sorry.
Yeah.
Go back to this. Yeah. So now, I'm sorry, go back down to scenario 2. So the 352,500 is basically what we're projecting the shortfall to be in the coming year if we do nothing. Amy, is that a fair way to summarize it?
Yes. So we already have the $180,000 accounted for. So yeah, it would be the 342,500.
Okay. So I think, Linda, my point of bringing that up is we're coming at it from a different point. But I think that the goal is the same, and that we're trying to solve the shortfall, and it's which number do we use? And I'd rather be wrong with mine, the 342, I guess, and then wrong with the 266. I don't know which one's going to be right, but I feel like the 342 is the number I should bring you to the Board of Finance to say, we think this is the right number to go solve to close this gap.
Yeah, and that's not a shortfall. That's just fixing prior allocations that were done in order to balance the Board of Selectmen budget.
Correct.
Agreed. Yeah, agreed.
I get why you like that, but that's not, you can't really call that the known shortfall or the expected shortfall.
I guess where I'm coming from, you're right, it's not definitive, but that, again, with the increase in 65,000 from pension and wage, those contribute directly to shortfall. So if we add that to yours, I mean, we're still within $10,000 or $15,000 of each other, right?
No, because my total costs to cover, can you go back to where you were? You just made everything you need to zoom out or something.
There we go.
Yeah, so your total costs are 522,000.
Yeah.
And mine are 381. So there is a significant difference there.
Gotcha. My mistake. So I'll give folks a minute to digest that. So that is an appreciable difference. I'm sorry, Linda, I wasn't thinking about it that way, but you're.
But I mean, I think the conversation is still a good one. So we have a difference on what the shortfall, if we want to use that word, is. Let's move on to talk about, approaches for dealing with it.
Fair enough. So Linda, do you want to go through some of your analysis with that?
Pardon?
Do you want to go through what you presented in your memo, or?
I mean, we all said $180,000 is a layup, no problem.
Mm-hmm.
And personally, I don't care what part of 180,000 is Tom's salary or facility or whatever. I mean, move whatever you want. Then again, I'm trying to find some solution or compromise that I feel like I can champion the Board of Finance. We need to come out of this with something that we can get the Board of Finance to accept, and it is not going to be easy. I already know that. And so, I talked with Amy about this, and, the idea here is we've been doing at the back end a subsidy that reduces the amount of money that then goes into reserves. And we have this collection rate assumption built around the notion that, it's falsely low, and that way we know we're going to get some amount of money that can go into reserves. So if we move it from the collection rate of 98.5, which is what it is now, to 98.6, it's only 1/10 of a point, it's a small move, that gives you $85,000 to put toward avoiding having a year-end subsidy that has to happen. So if you are recognizing that over the last several years there have been contributions on the back end, then you might as well build it into the front end and do it in a way that doesn't raise taxes. That's what I was trying to accomplish there, because it's the impact on the mill rate that gets everybody all wigged out.
Yep.
Now, that said, I can't propose raising it from 98.5 to 99.5 because that's just not going to fly, or even to 99. I mean, it's got to be something conservative or the Board of Finance isn't going to go for it. So I just went for 0.1%, figuring that getting half a loaf is better than getting no loaf. And if we push too hard, then that you'll get the no loaf problem.
Linda, haven't you had this discussion for years now?
What's that?
Haven't you had this discussion on raising the assumption for years?
And we have raised the assumption in past years.
I think last year was the first time I can recall.
No, they didn't do it last year. They were going to, and they stopped.
Okay, they bailed.
Yeah.
But they did do it 5-6 years ago. Yeah.
Okay.
My other feeling was that there ought to be, that it will make the Board of Finance happier, and me, if we look to raise some revenue from increasing fees. And the reason I felt comfortable even suggesting that was, and I totally get that we have to be sensitive to the market, but a large number of the fees, I got a spreadsheet from Tom on all these recreational skating fees and the paddle tennis fees. I didn't get the pool fees, at least I didn't print it. The vast majority of them have not been raised in 5, 6, 7 years. So to me, that tells me there's room to raise them. But I also noticed that the fees, when they were raised in the past, were always, if it was for, like one skating session, it went up by $5 increments. And if it was for annual rink time, it went up by $25 increments. And I feel like, well, it doesn't really have to go up by such large amounts. I mean, if that's a sort of psychological barrier that, well, we can't raise the fee because it's only, $2.16 more that we need, well, so raise it. I mean, nobody pays in cash anymore. It's not a question of making change. So
Linda, as I've mentioned in the past, when we set rates for the rink and the pool, we always set those based upon our direct costs, that we don't want to run anything there that runs a deficit. We have not included our fixed costs, nor do I, philosophically, I don't believe we should. Because to me, the fixed cost has always been a general fund responsibility. You don't get enough people skating or swimming to pay that amount of money to pay those fixed costs. If you were to put that into their fees, all of a sudden, Tom and John may be the only ones in the pool.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that you
Linda.
raise them by amounts, but I think what you're not hearing me say is that in the spirit of cooperation, if you want the Board of Finance to do something, you've got to offer something as well. And what you have to offer is an increase in fees that haven't been increased in years.
I'm not saying they can't be. I'm just saying historically we haven't done that.
Yeah,
Right.
let me jump in here, guys, if you don't mind, because I think there's something that works for both of you, and that minimum wage is going up, right?
Yep.
So, Jerry, to your point, your cost should be going up because you have to pay your rink guards more.
Absolutely.
And to Linda's point, the rates should be going to cover that cost. I'm not asking you, and I don't think Linda's asking you to raise the fees because the Zamboni gas costs more money.
No, it goes back to what I say. That is a direct cost.
Right.
And I have no problem of us raising fees to pay for direct costs. It is the indirect costs, those community expenses that I really have an issue with charging our users.
And philosophically, I'm with you where you're at. So again, I think potentially the compromise here, and Linda, I appreciate you bringing it up, is we're going to harden up that minimum wage impact number. And I think the way to look at it is we need to, when we set the fees, that the direct minimum wage impact, the fees should be going up to cover those for the rink, for the pool, et cetera. We can then have the debate of if they're becoming a market challenge, Tom. But at least what I think we walk out of here with at the end is the commitment to address the fees to cover those minimum
no
wage
argument
impact.
for me whatsoever.
And Sean, I just so I'm clear. So I maybe I didn't make myself clear before. We have raised the fees as minimum wage started going up.
I know you have.
Raised those fees.
Absolutely. No, I'm not saying you didn't, buddy. I'm just saying that because it's going up again, that's just something we all have to earmark for. We've got to do it again, and we've got to commit to the Board of Finance that we're doing it again. So that's essentially me saying to Linda here that when you come back with the fees, and I know you're going to present them with this, I'm going to look for that and be held accountable for the number we agree to here.
Right. Taking some of these overhead costs out allows us to have the room to absorb that minimum wage impact a little bit further as we go deeper or closer to 15. Because we don't have to make up. Right now, we're trying to make up minimum wage plus salaries and benefits, utilities, all of that things. Once the salaries and benefits and utilities come out and they're assumed to be the fixed cost of the town will hit, we can then price our programs accordingly to the direct costs that Jerry's talking about, which include the seasonal staff costs and the minimum wage increases that go with it.
Yeah, and that's where, Linda, I would potentially ask you your thoughts on, I know you've got the 180 bracket for the salaries, et cetera, but if we look at scenario 2 on the screen, the 180 is chewed up almost entirely by the, A, and then a little bit left over for B. So when we get down to C, that's not necessarily addressed by the 180. Now we can say, all right, well then put it all in C, but then A and B aren't addressed. So I guess from is it a potential compromise for everybody here that we do add that 167,500 to the math that you're talking about here, Linda? And then again, we're getting closer to that same $500,000 number. And I'm not looking to make this bigger, but I'm trying to get to the middle point where I think we're covering the shortfall and making sure that we're satisfying all the constituents here. Does that make sense, what I just said?
Absolutely. I think that's a great approach, Sean.
No disagreement here.
It's a compromise from everybody. I agree with Linda that we have to increase to cover costs, whether that's 20, Linda, or 30, based on, again, Tom's calculating what the effective minimum wage is going to be. But we can't ignore that we have this kind of albatross in the room of the utility and facility costs, when arbitrarily, the 180 was an arbitrary number, Linda, before your time. It was not the full nut that we were asking for or that we said we needed. And I think a recognition that that is the case is when we look at, a scenario 2 under C.
Yeah, I know that the bottom line here is going to be a debate, and everybody has different personal feelings about it as to what portion of this should be covered by user fees and what portion should be covered by taxes. Yep. And I can't predict, honestly, where my colleagues on the Board of Finance are going to be. I'm trying to help you come up with a proposal that's got the best likelihood of not making them go crazy.
I agree, Linda. My only addition to that, and I appreciate where you're coming from, is I want to make sure that I don't come back to you being $100,000 short and asking for a transfer after we did all this work.
But Sean, I'm also kind of trying to defend the Board of Selectmen a little bit here, that I don't want you to say, oh, sure, we'll take into our budget, this huge increase in costs. And then you're going to come to us and we're going to say in the tri-board meeting, okay, well, you get a 1.5% increase this year. And you're going to be saying, yeah, but I need an 11% increase to cover all of these things. And we're going to look at you like, hey, you wanted this, so you go figure it out.
Aren't you really looking for a 1-year exception to an increase?
So that happens every year.
Yeah, and that's where I think the exception is on the pension. I mean, the Board of Finance has granted us an exception, though, even though it shows up in our budget, that it doesn't necessarily count towards the guidance when we do prudent fiscal changes like updating pension assumption and otherwise. If the 2% or 2.5% includes the pension changes, well, the entirety of the pension change is more than 2%. So,
I can already see an elephant in the room in the golf budget next year, because you have an unsettled contract and you're going to have back wages for 2020 kicked into the 21-22 budget.
Yep, and we'll budget for that accordingly. We do that on the town side.
I know.
So that'll be addressed in the fees, and when it's unsettled, we need to make sure it's appropriately allocated. And Maria and Amy and Melissa have a lot of experience making sure those numbers are right. Again, it's imperfect, but I guess where I'm driving at, Linda, is if I'm wrong, I want to be wrong 100,000 in the good way.
Let me just throw a little bit something out, because I want to give something back to you, Linda. Okay, is the golf course has capital requests for the next 6 years. What effect on the budget does removing the golf course capital requests have?
I don't know off the top of my head.
Well, I do. I want to try and pull up something, but I don't know. I'll get to it. We have $376,000 of capital requests going out to the fiscal year 25. Those are small items exclusive of the 1.8 million for the irrigation system. What if I said the golf course, we'll figure out a way to pay for those and take those out of your 6-year capital budget? Does that give you some assistance?
Technically, no, because we still use the percentage of capital. It's just a matter of what goes in there. And your projects come out and other projects go in theory.
I'm just offering a bone.
Yep, no.
Let's keep it simple. Let's keep it simple.
I appreciate where you're coming from, but when we do the prioritization, we have to take that into account.
Yep.
But
but Jerry, Jerry, it's Chris. Don't you promote the fact that you all pay for you're self-sustaining for your capital?
No, we're self-sustaining for our equipment.
Capital equipment costs.
Equipment only.
But not infrastructure.
No, there's no room in our budget to pay for those unless we try to do something similar to our equipment maintenance fund with a capital equipment fund.
Yeah. Okay. I saw that's clarity. Thank you. It's to do two different things. I was misstating that then. Okay.
Just going back to, I appreciate that, Linda, you're looking out for the Board of Selectmen, and one of the ways that we have had a little pressure taken off of us is what Jerry just said, is that I can prioritize other town capital without having to pick between golf and otherwise. It's made the capital conversations a little bit easier. So I mean that does help, but I mean you're right. I don't want to stick 342 in my budget. All right.
So that's the last piece of what I was proposing, is that that you migrate it slowly, and maybe that doesn't really solve the problem very well, because it leaves the potential for there to be still a need for a year-end subsidy to the Parks and Recs. But I was trying to find a way for the Board of Selectmen not to have to eat a huge change all at once.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and I think that's where I think it's beyond this group, and that when we get to the tri-board meeting, we have to have a conversation with the Board of Finance and the Board of Selectmen about that. So let's say it's 350 needs to be contributed by the general fund. We can either A, mandate that it goes in the Board of Selectmen budget, or we can B, put it in the other spot that we talked about at the beginning, right? Where that it's basically a negative on the revenue side, Amy?
What's a negative on the revenue side?
The 350.
If it's a year-end transfer.
Yeah, and we put it in there basically as that's gonna chew up, to Linda's point, either some of the reserve transfer from the mill rate collection or the collection rate, or if we're up in building fees, whatever, it comes out in the wash of the 2 million that we just did, right?
Right.
So, and then my point is those are two ways to do it, or there's the third, which is the conversation with the Board of Selectmen and Board of Finance of we take 110 a year. So we take 110 the first year, we take 110 the second year, 220, and then the 122 or whatever's left in the third year from a budgetary impact. So it hits the budget over 2 or 3 years, so that it's then feathered into the budget. To
trying to make it more digestible.
Again, we got to pay for it. It's different ways to pay for it, and it's the tolerance that the taxpayers, the Board of Finance, and the Board of Selectmen have for how it impacts the budget is I think the way I'm looking at it. Does that make sense, Linda?
Sorry, I was looking at a spreadsheet at the same time, so I spaced out what you
I
said.
think Sean's
Sorry.
just spreading out that over a period of years, so it's not as impactful all in one year.
But then,
Yeah,
Sean, what problems does that create from a standpoint of transition of Board of Selectmen and Board of Finance members and Park and Rec members? You and I both know in the business world, we could make an agreement, and that agreement's going to be bound and followed. Where it seems like every year we just don't, even though we've reached this agreement, it's not something that we could count on implicitly that would be done. Is that an accurate statement or not?
It is, but we're susceptible to that regardless, right? So we can fix this whole thing right now, and then whoever replaces me and everyone else next year can undo it. Whether we've moved it, I mean, they could set up a third fund. They can do whatever they want, right? So
It's like a disappearing cart path money, Dave.
what's that?
No, we had an account for cart paths years ago where we charged people for it and it disappeared.
So can I get? I'm trying to practice my inner art and limit my questions and comments to the end of the conversation. What I need help with, Linda, is this. I think many people. Sometimes we have this fear, this acquiescence of the Board of Finance, which is something that really irritates me, frankly. So what I'm misunderstanding, if I was a taxpayer, I'm a town of Simsbury resident, and I didn't have to listen to all this root canal that we go through constantly, I would ask myself, why are you folks debating a known cost, seemingly, if the Board of Finance is this arbiter of perfection of accounting? Why are you contemplating this variable and this delta and accepting this delta potentially every year? Wouldn't you want something that is fixed and known? So my point carried forward here is that one of the reasons that I wanted to explore participating in this group, and it was the enlightenment that all of you have brought forth, this inconsistent accounting that happens with people like Tom's costs relative to his peers on Maria's leadership team. I look at this as a P&L. As we try to, sometimes it's the right thing to do, but not in the private sector. So I think that from the first thing we should have common practice across all of our accounting methodologies. We shouldn't have Tom, it's not about you, it's just your name. Okay. Tom be interpreted in a different way than Kristen is. That would be the first consistency that I would seek as I was on the Board of Finance. The second thing is that seemingly the taxpayer says, well, you're paying for this. Aren't you just moving? Aren't I already paying for this? You're moving this cost, this cost isn't new. It didn't start the year as unknown. The cost is absolutely known every single year. We know the cost is known every single year as we walk into this. So why haven't we created some consistency around it versus what is this? My interpretation, if I was a resident, is this general fund true up to close the gap at the end of each year, which again to me is not perfect accounting. It's imperfect. I understand
it's not transparent.
And I understand that it's certainly each year it ebbs and flows based upon participation,
weather,
program success, the weather, all of that. But we should be far closer than we are today to a fair, assumed, known cost that we should be covering. And if it has to come from taxes, it has to come from taxes, because the taxpayer isn't, in my mind, because the taxpayer is assuming it's coming from taxes. Well, it really is. If it's just from a true up from a cash account at the end of the year, which is what it looks like, why are we still managing our money in that way? So why do we have a fear of the Board of Finance that we shouldn't move to a more consistent process across all of our platforms so that they don't have to take interpretation is the last thing that should occur with numbers. We should never interpret numbers.
All subject to subjectivity.
Agreed. Let me jump in here, guys. So Chris, you're saying all the right things, but remember, we are taxing the residents for this already. It's just where. To right. Linda's point earlier, we have a 98.5% collection rate. We don't have a 99.5. So we are taxing the residents 1%, assuming we're not going to collect as much taxes as we do. And we use that 1% to then.
Yeah, but we've known that. Sean, you and I have argued this over many years.
I understand.
how many times we have to touch the stove before we know it's hot? We've had the same tax rate collection for how many years now?
I agree. So here's my point, and this is what I'm getting to, is this is very simple. If we lower the collection, or excuse me, if we increase the collection rate to offset this increase. If we're not willing to do that as a town, then it has to come from the creative solutions that Linda proposed, and or it's an increase in the Board of Selectmen budget if we want to keep the collection rate where it is. If we move everything in concert with each other, you're right, Chris, it just cancels itself out and there's no tax increase.
So, Chris, I think one thing that I didn't say before is I know the Board of Finance, is hesitant to increase the collection rate assumption, in part because the rating agencies really like us having a very conservative collection rate assumption. Because when years like this year happen, they don't worry that, oh my God, they're not going to collect what they thought they were. I mean, it builds in a cushion. And I mean, I always worry that we're overtaxing people because of that. But the flip side of that is you have a very good cushion so that if things go sour, you have extra money to use. And if they don't go sour, you have money to put into reserves and keep continuously building those reserves. And the rating agencies love that, and the finance board likes to make the rating agencies happy.
So for this, Linda, everything, you're absolutely right. So I think for this evening, I think we're generally, if this is a true statement, let me know for everybody, we're generally in the ballpark in terms of the overall numbers. It's a matter of what the recommendation is on how to pay for it, right? Is that a fair way to summarize where we're at?
I would agree with you, Sean.
I think there's going to be some difficulty, with numbers quite as high as we're recommending we tackle, unless we see a pretty big contribution from increases in fees. And I mean, that's the fundamental debate here that's going to happen at the Board of Finances. There's a shortfall here. It's a known number. Should it come from user fees or from broad taxes? And I'm trying to propose a combination of the two. And it's just a question of what proportion comes from each.
Absolutely. And that's what I'd like to be our takeaway from this evening is, and Linda, I appreciate the work that you did and everyone else, the comments you made tonight of looking at basically an enhanced version of what we've got, in that we've got the 180, and then we've got some user fees, which we talked about, and we can get a better number on that when we file down what the minimum wages are. And then is there an additional number that we want to put on there? Again, that's a philosophical debate over and above the minimum wages. And then what is the 1, 2, or 3 ways that this can be done, as I kind of talked about before, all the way in the Board of Selectmen budget, which I don't love and I don't know how I'm going to pay for, partially in the Board of Selectmen budget over time, or continuing to be made up for through transfers, which I don't think makes sense either. And then then we're down, Linda, to I think what you're saying is the philosophical argument of how do we pay for the shortfall, right? And I think this committee then makes a recommendation as best we can, but it's very much up to the Board of Selectmen and Board of Finance in the context of the tri-board meeting and the actual budget when we get all the other numbers to fully solve that problem. There's been a lot of suggestions on using, how do we do capital? How do we phase in the solar revenue? Do we, there's a lot of things that are on the table that I don't want to dive into here, because I think they're for the Board of Finance to consider with the other two boards, if that makes sense. But what I'm driving at is can we come, what I'm proposing is the next time, Amy, Melissa, and Maria, I think you're back, looking at Linda's memo, looking at scenario 2 in terms of what we've got here, firming up those minimum wage numbers, looking at and then Tom looking at the fee structure, again, somewhat prospectively. I know we just did them.
And looking
go ahead.
with eye not to just, we won't count those costs to go into the fees, but rather, what's the most we can get out of fees?
We do that. Jerry speaks for Jerry before to some extent. I mean, we do. I have to turn in a budget every year that's relatively even on the expense side with the revenue side. I mean, there's just sometimes it just doesn't happen, and we need that subsidy. But we do our best to try to turn in a budget that meets everything. And it's just gotten to the point with the fee, the utility costs have gone up, the salaries and benefits have gone up. It's become to that point where it's impossible to do that.
Yep.
So we do try to account for the utilities, the hard costs, that kind of thing. It's just we're asking for help now.
Yep, and let me say it a different way, Tom. So basically, we've got roughly a 15% weather factor that we've never budgeted for. Is and again, not an exact number, but what we're trying to figure out here is how are we going to divide up the 15% and no longer ignore it, and we are going to budget for it.
Yeah, if I can just interject, it's extremely difficult for the rink or the pool since they both have such short seasons. Golf is a much easier tangible to deal with when you're dealing with 8 months or 9 months versus a 3-month season. Mm-hmm. What's digestible? You go out on the different chats and stuff out there, and they start talking about what the hell is the town doing, charging so much for me to go swimming or for me to go skating. For a public skate is an hour, Tom, and we're charging $5 or $8. You're going to have to take a look at substantially increasing the amount that you charge. And I'm not talking minimal. I'm talking substantial to cover those costs.
Yeah, and I'm not suggesting that you need to bear it the entirety, and I don't think Linda is either.
I understand that, but what's the number?
I don't know. That's the homework assignment.
Well, the number's simple if you throw everything back in the general fund.
Then you don't ever have to raise fees.
That's right. But we would anyway, because we know we have to cover costs.
So Jerry, it is going back in the general fund. I think you've won the debate. The problem is that
yes,
we have to budget for it, and I have to tell the Board of Finance how I'm going to pay for it. And I can't go to the Board of Finance with a $352,000 increase and pay my police officers and my plow drivers what I contractually promised them. That budget will fail.
And
so I need your help.
My heartfelt thanks.
I need your help, and I need the rest of this group's help to go back. And if you can't give me anything, so be it. But I need you to go look at the minimum wage numbers and see what else is in those costs that you guys talked about. And Tom, I know you've done it. I'm asking, go take a quick look again and try to meet Linda and everybody a third of the way here. And that doesn't mean a perfect third where you're going to take an entire 5% of it, but what percentage do you take? What percentage does the Board of Selectmen take? And can the Board of Finance get a little creative with feathering it in to ease the impact to us so that we're not hitting the taxpayers or the budgets overall at one time? I think that's where we're generally all at right now.
I think we're all in agreement that a wrong has been created that we're trying to correct. And it's just a matter of how would best impact all of the town as one.
Correct.
Sean, I like the approach you're taking. Let me just add one other point, though, that in addition to the very sensitive fees and where they have been and so forth, we also have to manage, if it's $5 to $8 for an hour of use of the rink for skating, what does it cost somewhere else? A round of golf costs X. What does it cost commercially? What does it cost somewhere else?
Correct.
So in this spirit of we're all going to have to ante up, it's not just where it has been, but how are we competitively so that we can make this budget target we're trying to do here, and obviously not shut off the public, but charge a reasonable fee in commensurate with what the market is showing.
Absolutely, Art, and Tom and Dave and the board do a pretty painstaking process. So they've got some pretty substantial spreadsheets
Good.
right, Tom, on those very comparisons. They go out and look at all the golf courses. They go out and look at all the rinks. They get the hourly rate for hockey teams, et cetera. So that there is a substantial amount of data and analysis that is done on that.
Okay, sorry.
No. Your point is right, and that's why I'm asking Tom. You and I are saying the same thing. I'm asking Tom to go back and look at that and make sure that we've sharpened that as much as possible. And if there's another place to go visit, Linda suggested, maybe we change the fees. I don't want to charge the school necessarily more, but are we out of whack there? Is that a place?
Well, you say school? I mean, does the Board of Education, does the school hockey team get charged the same amount as any other hockey team?
So, no, they do not.
Why not?
Because long ago, Mr. House, long ago, there was some discussion about the town giving the Simsbury Farms giving a discount to the local youth hockey organization and the local Board of Education.
Well, that's exactly the kind of thing I think we're going to have to revisit.
Program. I will tell you, West Hartford, if you want to do a comp for West Hartford, their rink, the town rink doesn't charge the Board of Ed for use of they have 2 high school hockey teams, 2 different high schools. None of their programs paid a rental fee at the town ice rink. We're getting roughly 80% of the market of what our regular prices are for from our Board of Ed. Now, could they go up? From my understanding, when Jerry Toner was the director, for many times he went to the governing organizations, whether it was the Rec Commission or the Board of Selectmen, and asked for a fee increase for the Board of Ed, and he was on the Board of Ed rates, and he was shot down. Basically because we said, we're basically taking money from one pot of the town's money and putting it into the other pocket of the town's money.
That's what we're doing totally in this whole exercise here. Moving.
If I could even interject another thing, the up until we were going to be charging the high school golf team this year for the first time ever. That was something we brought up in years past, and boy, did we get our ears chewed off.
Yeah, and in my short time here, we have raised the rates on the Board of Ed. I have raised the rates on the other ones, and again, like Jerry said, I introduced the fee for the golf team last year more than what was ever charged before. Unfortunately, we didn't see the result this year because of COVID, but it'll be in place next year.
But how many years did we try to do that and got shot down?
Understood. Yeah.
So guys, I don't want to go through the history.
If I could, let me jump in here. John, we are going to sharpen our pencil, and we're going to look at, you've been around long enough. We are so thoughtful. The research that is done is second to none. We justify every increase we ask for, and every time we say to keep the rates the same. For the purpose of our group, I'm going to assure you that we're going to get together and we will look at this again. I think it's kind of an academic discussion right now. Because we need to know some of those fixed costs of the minimum wage and what have you. So instead of continuing this round and round, I assure you before our next meeting, we will have a discussion and we will come back ready to talk with you about any proposed fee increases and the basis for them.
I appreciate that. And Linda and Art, I think that's what you're getting at, right? So
Exactly. Yeah.
And then I'll work with. Go ahead.
Sean, can I just one point about the school team? As far as I know, the high school pays the full costs of every other sport that they sponsor. So I don't know why they shouldn't pay the full cost of hockey as well. And if they don't pay the full cost, it's raised by that team. They have various benefits and stuff they do. You don't have the Board of Selectmen subsidizing the Board of Ed sports teams. And so that's enough said on that.
Discussion with the Board of Ed then?
Yeah. That's a little beyond, it's a little beyond Park and Rec, yeah.
Yep.
So again, Dave, what you said, Dave, what you said is what I exactly what I'm asking for here. And then I'll work with Maria and Chris and Amy on some potential scenarios in terms of phasing, feathering, pensions, et cetera. Again, I don't want to get too cute or complicated here, but I think if we lay out a couple of scenarios, and then again, the goal is to present. I think we're in agreement, generally speaking, on the costs. We're in the ballpark on the number, and then if we can come within the same ballpark in terms of what are we recommending to the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Finance as a potential solution here. The Board of Finance is going to do whatever they think is best in the context of the entire $100 million nugget. And the Board of Selectmen is going to have to take this into account for our $20+ million budget, et cetera. But this gives us, I think, a substantial head start in having a thoughtful discussion and a quicker decision when it comes to tri-board and budget time for those challenges. Is that fair, guys?
I think, Sean, what you outlined is we know what we're going to do. It's just how we're going to do it.
Yep.
Agreed.
And again, folks on both boards can have at it, Linda. You know, folks can disagree with us, and that's totally okay. But at the end of the day, I think we're going to walk out of this doing what we were charged with doing, which is doing some research, doing some homework, making sure that we had our facts straight, and presenting some intelligent options to the boards to then vote on and take to the taxpayers.
Full agreement.
So, all right, we're going to give everybody, and I know, Linda, this is going to conflict with your traveling, we'll give everybody a couple of weeks on this one, with the goal that we would like to have this voted on and presentable before the tri-board meeting, if that makes sense, because I think that will be an important conversation to have in the context of the entirety of that meeting. And Linda, I believe you're going to be back for part of that. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Yes.
So then, again,
Number, right?
okay.
Yeah.
So again, you know, I think we've done the urgency part here. Now we can refine the numbers, give the Culture Parks and Rec Board time to review it, give Amy and Maria and Melissa time to look at it in the context of the tri-board presentation, and then we can be prepared to make as firm of a recommendation as this group is comfortable with ahead of that tri-board meeting, and then we can go from there. Sound good?
I'll do some modeling of those the way I've done it with the golf course.
Appreciate it. Guys, we went longer than I promised you, but I think this was really, really good discussion. I appreciate all the work on this and the thoughtfulness and willing to compromise. And we will get back together soon.
Thank
Good
you all
leadership
very
of the
much.
discussion,
Hard
Sean.
work.
All right, guys, I appreciate it. We'll consider ourselves adjourned.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
the show there,
Have a
Sean.
great night.